Well, good morning. Good to see you this morning. Please do take out your message outline. And if you have a Bible, I would encourage you to turn up to Samuel 12, actually chapters 11 and 12. But certainly do have the outline open in front of you so you know where we're going this morning. And we're in this series, as you know, called a series I've called Knowing God. We began it last week. And the whole idea of this series is why it's important to know God and how it's actually possible. And we began it last week. We looked at a critical passage. We looked at Genesis 3. And we talked about what was wrong with the world. Well, this morning, I want to draw your attention to another story in the Old Testament. And this is a story which is such a dark and terrible blot on the whole history of King David, in order that we look at something that we perhaps don't like to look at, but that is the whole problem of sin. Now, the reason that I'm doing this morning is not because I delight in choosing a theme such as this, the thing that we're considering this morning, which, in fact, let's be honest, most people don't want to think about. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to hear a message about it. And I can honestly say that I dislike thinking about this question of sin. And if I'm really honest, I wish that we could be thinking about something else this morning. But I felt that we needed to talk about these things, because if only we could be talking about the love of God and other themes that are enjoyable, that would be great. But that's not how the Bible sees it. In fact, there is not much point in thinking about God's love until you first of all have to think about this question of sin. We have to deal with the problem of sin for one reason only, and that is because it is a fact. It is vitally important that we realise the exact nature of the fact of sin. And that's why we're looking at this story, which throws so much light on the deep nature of sin. And the details of this particular case, they don't necessarily matter too much in as of themselves. The value and the importance lie in the principles that is illustrated here. And that's important because today people seem to have two main difficulties when it comes to understanding the biblical view of sin and salvation. Let me give you two sort of difficulties people face. First of all, people see salvation, it's seen as theoretical. Some people tend to be far too detached and theoretical and almost entirely divorced from the actual reality of salvation. One of the greatest enemies of true Christianity is the fact that religion is so interesting. I mean, interesting from the standpoint of thinking and debate and philosophy, and interesting, therefore, as a matter of opportunity to have debate and discussion. Religious discussions have always been popular, and they still are, aren't they? People love expressing their views about who they think God is and who he is and what he should do. People enjoy taking the various sides of the debate when it comes to the biblical view on certain subjects. So, for example, think about how often people who don't go to church, they don't read the Bible, they don't care about God, who then get all aggressive when the true church, and I highlight those words, the true church says, for example, that same-sex marriage is wrong. And then they want to debate and argue the point and say that the church has no right to say that sort of stuff in a modern society, but they have no intention of ever going to church. Or when a Bible-believing church says that there's only one way to know God, that is through Christ alone, and then the debates come, we'll say, well, hold on a minute, that can't be right. Isn't that a bit narrow thinking today? What about other religions? And very often religious discussions are discussed in a very sort of detached way. The problem with this is that we forget that these discussions should be of vital concern to us because they have eternal significance. If only someone would say at the beginning of one of these sort of debates or one of these discussions, they got up and said, okay, everyone, just remember that though we cannot see him, God can see us. And though we can't hear him with the natural ear, he can and he does hear us. And remember also that we are but people of this time and that he is in fact eternal. Above all, bear in mind as you speak his return and the fact that any moment we don't know when he will return, but one day we will find ourselves standing before him as our judge. Now you can begin the discussion. No one says that, do they? If only someone said that, I wonder what difference it would make in those debates and discussions. Or if someone would remind us of what we are and what lives we have lived. Like David in the passage before us, I think we'd be a little bit more careful in our expressions of our opinion about what we think about God and salvation. In other words, when it comes to all these discussions about Christianity and the Bible, it's often done in a sort of an abstract, detached way, theoretical way. But in reality, you are discussing yourself, even as David was with Nathan. Secondly, though, sin is seen as just a weakness. Now, the second main difficulty, in a sense, rises out of the first, and it's the utter failure to realise the true nature of the problem with which the Bible is concerned. And that is the true and deep nature of sin. Because the problem today is that people do not view sin deeply and profoundly. In other words, modern men and women regard it lightly and are thoroughly optimistic about it, and therefore to its treatment. How to deal with sin? We don't even talk about it, don't even use the word sin. It's because people see sin as just a weakness or some negative phase in human history, or something that can be explained by maybe a lack of culture or a lack of education, or that it can be eradicated by some type of sort of self-help or therapy, or just a matter of time. It will work itself out. I cannot see any need or necessity for the kind of salvation taught in the Bible, a salvation demanding an atoning sacrifice. Or that when it comes to men and women, the Bible uses terms such as being born again and regeneration and repentance. Jesus isn't something you just add on to your life to make it a little bit better than what it is. Now, if the problem is simple, then the solution also must be simple. That's the thinking. And there is a sense in which it is utterly impossible for modern men and women who have not seen the nature of sin to believe in and accept the gospel offer of salvation. It just seems so irrelevant today. Why on earth do we need a saviour? Why on earth do we need to listen to this message? The modern person not only does not see sin as it is from God's standpoint, he also fails to see himself from his own standpoint. He not only does not know God, he does not even know himself. The trouble is that we all by nature refuse to face honestly the problem of ourselves and our own inner nature. And so what we do, we argue about our ideal selves instead of our actual selves, the reality of who we really are. We refuse to face the naked truth of our own hearts as they really are. See, if only we face the truth about ourselves, we would soon be right on the question of sin, wouldn't we? We would soon realise its terrible and awful nature, and above all, its terrible fulsome power. And it's in order that we may be helped to do so that we're going to look at this incident in the life of David. See, King David stands out as one of the greatest, if not the greatest man in the whole of the Old Testament. Not only that, he is one of those lovable characters that we admire. I mean, I don't know about you, but you read about the life of David, you think, what a really good bloke. He was a good man. He was a religious man. He was a devout man. But perhaps the most outstanding trait in his character was his decency. He was a decent man, an honourable man. There is surely nothing grander anywhere in literature than David's loyalty and faithfulness to King Saul. He was the king who was on the throne before David. In spite of insults and abuses, and in spite of jealousy and treachery, in spite of Saul's repeated attempts to kill David because he knew that David was going to be the next king, David had a real sense of respect for him, even though Saul hounded David from place to place. On 2 occasions, Saul's life was in David's hands, and most people would say that in view of what Saul had done to David, and in view of what he knew of the future, he would be fully justified in killing him. But David does not do so, though he's encouraged to do so by his soldiers and by those around him. And when a man comes to inform him of Saul's death, you would think that David would be so pleased, so excited, so thrilled. And yet, the messenger discovers that David is saddened by the news. Even though David was going to be then promoted to the throne. It meant nothing to him. So here is a good, godly, noble man, a real king in the sense of the highest term of what a king should be. And yet, it is the self-same man who is capable of the most cowardly, devious, utterly selfish and despicable action which is recorded for us in 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. Let me show you what David did. We didn't read this bit. You read the aftermath. Let me read what took place in 2 Samuel 11 verses 1 through 5. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. Now that should give you a clue that there's a problem here. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And even at that point, he's got a way out here. Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanliness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, "I am pregnant." Now you can imagine at that point, the panic mode went in for David, didn't it? He has slept with another man's wife, and he knew he was another man's wife because the messenger tells her, his servant tells him that. And you just didn't do that, especially as king. So David comes up with a plan to think to himself, well, I'm in trouble now. So he has this plan in his mind to bring Uriah, her husband, back from the battlefield, get him to stay, go home, sleep with his wife, with Bathsheba, and then everyone will think that then Uriah is the father of the child, even though it's David's. Pretty sneaky, eh? I mean, you know, some of the soaps on the television, isn't it? But things don't go to plan. Because Uriah was a loyal man. He was, in fact, an honourable man. He wouldn't leave the men behind on the battlefield to go home and enjoy time with his wife. So he doesn't do that. So therefore, David's now got to do something else. So David arranges for Uriah to be put in the middle of the battle, knowing he would get killed, which is what happened. Look, 2 Samuel 11, 14 to 16. David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, "Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw for him so that he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. It's almost unbelievable, isn't it? That it actually happened. The man who is characterised above all else by his decency becomes a cheat. The loyal becomes a traitor. The man who was so ready to forgive and to put up with insults becomes a murderer. The terrible and the terrifying thing is not only is that recorded here, but such a thing is possible from such a man like David. How do you explain it? How could such a thing be possible from such a man like this? How could such a great man fall to the depths of sinfulness, adultery, murder, lies, deceiving people? What is it that happens to a man like that makes him capable of an action that is so contradictory to all that he represents? Is it mere weakness? Is it a lack of knowledge? Is it temporary forgetfulness of better things? Or is there something else? And the answer is that it is something deep, profound, terrible. It is a mighty power, and it is in you and it is in me. It does not take the same form, but it is always there, and it is always in our nature. Stop and think for a moment about yourself and your own experience. Face for a moment the struggles that go on within your own heart. Consider the thoughts and the desires that grip you from time to time. Do you want to share those in public now? Would you like the world to know all about those secret things? All those secret thoughts and desires? See, if only we started there in our religious discussions instead of arguing theoretically about things. Because when a man and a woman really know themselves, then they know something of the nature of the problem of sin. And they don't want to argue about the elements of the Bible or the gospel message or grace. No, what they do is they just thank God for them that he actually sent Christ as their Saviour. They accept him as Saviour and Lord with their whole heart and soul and mind. So because this is important, if you've never accepted the grace of God that he offers you in Jesus Christ, I want to spend the rest of our time looking at what we are told about sin in this terrible story. And hear me carefully here, we are looking at ourselves as we look at David. Now there are three clearly defined principles here. The first is this, that sin is an overpowering force. Sin is far from being just mere weakness. It's actually an overpowering and blinding force which defeats even the strongest human nature. And it's this that people today don't understand. Sin as a power, as a force, is not appreciated and understood as it should be. It's often explained away in terms of, say, material or biological reasons. Society does not see sin as a force and a power separately from human beings and the various factors that operate on the human race. And yet that's the whole horror of sin. It's such a power, it's such a force, that taking hold of us, it can manipulate us at will, and it can make us believe as it chooses, upsetting all our previous actions and decisions. Now we see that, I think, very clearly here in David. Notice the power of sin in two ways. Firstly, the power of sin sweeps aside all other interests. The power of sin is seen clearly in the way in which it entirely sweeps aside all interests and considerations for the time being. Now look at the case of David. This one desire of his, this one, let's call it this one lust, this lust for sin, entirely grips him at the expense of everything else that we know to be true about him. In other words, it initially makes an entirely different man of him. Nowhere in the story is the fact put quite so clearly as in 2 Samuel 11. Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, when you have finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up and he may ask you, why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerub-Besheth? Didn't a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall, so he died in Thebez? Why did you get so close to the wall? If he asks you this, then say to him, also your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. Now Joab here was not just a great warrior and general, he also shows himself to be quite a good psychologist, doesn't he? Because he knows something of the power of sin. He sends a man to David with a report of the battle. Things had not gone well. Joab had made a mistake. He knew that David would be annoyed, so he instructs his messenger what to say. And when he says to him, look, when you tell him this and David starts getting angry, all you have to say is this: your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. Now, normally David would be anxious, he would be concerned about the successes of his troops. In fact, the reality would be is that he would be there with them. He was concerned about the honour of Israel. But under the grip of sin, all these things don't count. They become unimportant to him. David sees and desires one thing and one thing only. As long as that is gratified, as long as that is granted, he doesn't care what the price or the cost may be. This one thing, that Uriah is dead, is most important to him. And it sweeps aside pride of his country, pride of military achievement, and everything else. It is a consuming passion. Now, this is only one illustration of that which is always true of sin. Think of a person in a temper and a rage, for example. Think of yourself in that condition. He says and does things which he never normally does, and he bitterly regrets it afterwards. Even while the person who is lost it, who is full of anger and rage, even while he is saying them, there is this warning and restraining voice within, but it scarcely counts at all. This terrible power which is gripping and driving him, and he is helpless. He doesn't care in that moment of anger and rage who he hurts, what he says to them, or what the consequences might be. You don't care. The one thing he desires is to do and say that which grips him at that moment. Give you another one. Jealousy and envy. What about those? Malice and bitterness. They all work the same way. They entirely monopolise and consume us. The jealous person, for example, can see nothing but the object of his or her envy. The fact is that they may be doing very well themselves. They may have lots of wonderful things in their lives, but that doesn't satisfy. It's the other object that matters. Though he may have everything a person desires, it will not satisfy him. Because he desires something that somebody else has. And under that terrible grip and power of the passion, some of the terrible things that can happen take place. Think about how a wrong, when we've been wronged, whether imagined or real, can really grip us. Or the desire for revenge is waiting for the opportunity to retaliate and to pay back. Think also of the way people risk their reputation, they risk their character, their honour, and sometimes even their life and their health for the sake of gratifying some desire that seems to take them over. For example, a man may love his wife and his children very much, but if he is unfortunately a slave to the lust for drink, that will be pushed aside. They will be pushed aside. There is many an alcoholic who drinks in secrets, even though the whole family knows that he or she has a problem, and yet he will deny it when challenged. But his life and his relationships and work and health is suffering, and deep down he or she knows. And yet they deny it. But all that doesn't matter, because the lust for another drink has consumed him. Or someone has worked hard and they've made a good home and a good living, and they enjoy a high level of living and material possessions, and yet they become a slave to gambling, which is a growing problem in our society. And they will stake everything on that bet. On and on I could go, giving you example after example after example. Rationally speaking, they know it is stupid, and yet the consuming desire and passion overtakes them. And therefore explains a case like this of David, doesn't it? It explains the terrible downfall of a decent man from many a high position. It explains everything in our own life of which we are ashamed of. We don't want to do it, but we do it anyway. Sin sweeps all other interests aside, and it entirely controls us. Secondly, the power of sin paralyses our better judgment. And that is why it leads to all the results we've just been thinking about and are considering this morning. And that is also why optimistic views and about the treatment of sin, maybe by education or therapy or social environments, are literally just so pathetic. David and his son Solomon are two of the wisest and sanest men in the whole of the Old Testament. And yet they are both guilty of sin. But the same is true of all the great, learned and wise men of the world. Because it's one thing to draw up an ethical, moral code. The difficult lies in putting it into practice, doesn't it? In a sense, every sin we have ever committed is a sin against our own better judgment. And is always the result of a battle between conscience and this terrible force and power. And how subtle it is, and how clever at twisting and perverting what we know to be the real truth. And that is why remorse always follows sin. And it leaves us without any excuse whatsoever. Because after the sin, sometimes there is anger and spitefulness or lust or craving or whatever. It may be that we simply cannot understand ourselves or explain ourselves how it was that we came to do such a terrible thing when we sin. There seems nothing in its favour and everything is against it. And yet we did it. Why? There is only one explanation. The power called sin paralysed us and blinded us. It mastered us and it overpowered us. Even the knowledge of right and wrong does not preserve us, does it? Romans 3:20 says this: "For no one can ever be made right in God's sight by doing what his law commands. For the more we know God's law, i.e. Scripture, God's teaching, the clearer it becomes that we aren't obeying it." Find that? If you know your Bible well, then you should be thinking to yourself, wow, there's more that I'm not doing than what I'm actually doing. In fact, later on in Romans, Paul says in Romans 7:19, when I want to do good, I don't. And when I try not to do wrong, I do it anyway. Anybody else want to give a testimony on that? And this is the Apostle Paul. He wrote half the New Testament. This was a man of knowledge and of culture, a man who was an expert in Old Testament law. And yet he says, I still mess up. So we can see that sin is this overpowering force, and it sweeps aside all other interests and it paralyses our better judgment. Secondly, therefore, in light of that, sin deserves punishment. Now, the second principle is that sin is utterly indefensible, and therefore it deserves punishment. The real value of 2 Samuel 12 is that it brings us to this truth, and in particular, it shows us this in a very clear and irrefutable way. In other words, what we see here, it takes away every excuse that can ever be offered for sin, and shows that the knowledge we possess already sort of sweeps the ground from underneath us as we try to defend ourselves. Let me show you a couple of things how sin is deserving of punishment. First of all, we ourselves agree that sin deserves punishment. Now this passage shows that we ourselves utterly condemn sin, and we say that it's deserving of the severest of punishments. Now that is the real masterstroke in the interview between Nathan the prophet and David. He makes David deliver an impartial verdict on himself and his own actions. Because here's the thing. The whole difficulty with the question of sin is that we scarcely ever regard it in this way. We are always on the defensive. And our views are coloured by our actions and by the consequences that we fear will follow any opinion we may give. We are always out to defend ourselves, aren't we? It's remarkable how clever we are at explaining away the things that we've done. We try to justify ourselves. We lie our way through it. We do all sorts of things to defend ourselves. We are equally able to satisfy ourselves and persuade ourselves that all is well and that therefore we don't deserve punishment whatsoever. But we're not quite as clever as we imagine ourselves to be, and we are constantly condemning ourselves in what we say about others. Let me show you what I mean from the passage. 2 Samuel 12, 1-4. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, there were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveller came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveller who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. Wow. Now David, without the slightest hesitation, and remember, he's not recognising himself here, he delivers the true verdict, doesn't he? Verses 5-6. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. Now, David here, he sees how terrible sin is, and he's definite that it must be punished, and it must be punished very severely. He says that what has taken place is utterly without excuse, that it cannot be defended on any grounds whatsoever, that what took place was utterly monstrous. Now, he had never said that to himself about his own terrible actions of committing adultery with Bathsheba and murdering Uriah in chapter 11, had he? Why? Because of the instinct of self-defense and self-preservation. But here, he takes the ground from under his own feet, and he has to admit that his sin is utterly indefensible and that it and he deserves punishment. Paul in Romans 2, 14-15 points precisely the same thing out when he says this. Even when Gentiles who do not have God's written law instinctively follow what the law says, they show that in their hearts they know right from wrong. They demonstrate that God's law is written within them, for their own consciences either accuse them or tell them that they are doing what is right. And what he means by that is that the opinions which people express on one another and their actions is proof positive that they know what is right and what is wrong. See, people say, oh, well, people don't know what they're doing. Yes, they do. We know what's right or wrong. This verse tells us it's built within every single one of us. Take the personal element out and the desire for self-protection, you're left with the fact that we know what sin is, and we know that sin is without defence, and we know that sin deserves punishment. We know this to be true, don't we? So, for example, when someone has clearly committed a crime, and then they get off scot-free on some technicality, there's an outcry in the press, isn't there? We all get annoyed. That's not fair. They certainly are guilty. We know that sin is without defence and deserves punishment, which is exactly what David says. But more than that, secondly, God agrees that sin deserves punishment. What is more vital and important is that God, who has the right and the power, also says the same thing about sin. 2 Samuel 11:27. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. You see, the first revelation in the Bible is that God is a holy God. He hates sin. In fact, he utterly detests it. His wrath and his holy anger are stirred up against sin. He has stated clearly that there is no excuse for it, that it will be punished. Had you all realised that? Had you realised that sin is utterly indefensible? That's the biblical verdict on sin. I'll tell you what, let's do something for a moment. Let's adopt the method of Nathan for a moment, and I'll get you to deliver your verdict on sin. Okay? So what I'm going to do this morning, I'm going to give you 3 cases. Okay? Carefully, I want you to think of these things, and you're going to act as judge. Okay? So you're acting judge. Here are 3 cases I've put to you. Ready? Case number 1, first of all. What do you think of a man who betrays a solemn and sacred trust? Think of a man who has been given the responsibility to care for and guard something which is very valuable that belongs to another person. The person who gave it to him trusted him. But the man, instead of guarding it and taking care of it, he steals it, he sells it, and he uses the proceeds from selling it to please himself, to satisfy his own cravings, his own desires for pleasure. Though the thing did not belong to him, and though the owner paid him a very great compliment by putting him in charge of it, that is how he behaved. He betrays the sacred charge and trust. Now, what do you think of him? Can you suggest any defence for the man and what he has done? Can you say anything by way of lessening his crime and his offence? Is there any defence for such an action? So what does the man deserve? What does the law of the land say? What would any judge say about him? What do you say about him? Surely the only correct conclusion is to say that he is guilty, that his actions are utterly indefensible. Give you a second case. Case number 2. Here is a man who is face to face with a wonderful opportunity, what we would call maybe a golden opportunity. He's been left some money, or he's been left a business, or by some pure bit of coincidence, he's been introduced to someone who gives him this fantastic position in their company, and he sets him on the ladder, which will eventually, may well reach to wonderful success and promotion. Without the man doing anything at all, this extraordinary opportunity has come his way. All he needs to do is realise that, to take full advantage of it, and with application and determination, he can do all he can to improve the opportunity, and he will reap the full benefits. But instead of doing so, this particular man regards it all quite lightly. He plays with it for a little while, and then either on account of his laziness or something else, he neglects it altogether and allows it to come to nothing. Quite deliberately, he squanders the golden opportunity. He objects to the amount of work he is called to do. He wants to be out enjoying himself with his friends. He resents the amount of discipline that is necessary. Though it has been shown clearly to him that he's been given this amazing opportunity, a little application on his part now will lead to unbelievable results in the future. He doesn't care about that whatsoever. He prefers to enjoy himself now. He deliberately throws away his great chance and opportunity, and at the end he finds himself penniless and helpless. Well, what about him? What have you to say about him? Is there any way that you can defend him and justify his actions? You could say he's just been stupid. But does he deserve anything but misery and failure and punishment? And what about the person who does that kind of thing several times, given many chances and still does it time and time again? Take one more case, case number 3. Think of a man who has been shown great kindness by another, who has been trusted in a most generous way. A man who has been charged with the care of valuables in the way in which I described in our first hypothetical case. Let's assume that when the valuables were lost, the owner forgave the man to whom they were entrusted in spite of his treachery and refrained from punishing him, gave him a free pardon, and instead of sacking him, not only gave him another chance, but actually gave him a promotion and went out of his way to be kind to him. But the man, instead of appreciating all of this, just takes what advantages he can get out of it, and he therefore insults the generous benefactor. His whole attitude to him is one of ingratitude and failure to appreciate the graciousness of his actions. He's scarcely ever in his presence. He is even insulting and tries to claim that somehow or another he has been wronged, and regards the one who has shown him so much goodness. He regards him as an enemy. Now, what do you think of such a person? What can you say about a man who is utterly ungrateful, and who ignores and insults a generous giver and his gifts? Surely the only conclusion is that he is someone who deserves not only the loss and the forfeiting of all that he has been given, but also the most severe of punishments. Consider these three cases. Deliver your verdict. Face these impartially and neutrally. There can be just one result, isn't there? The three are utterly indefensible in their actions and in themselves, and they deserve to be severely punished. There can be no doubt about it whatsoever. But just wait one moment. Because these three cases are parables of what is true of all men and women who are not Christians, who do not believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. The soul is God's gift to people. In fact, life itself is God's gift to us. We were not meant to use it for ourselves and for our own gratification. God has given us this treasure that we may guard it and preserve it, handle it in a way that he desires, and at the end give an account to him of our stewardship, of our soul, of our life. No person has a right to live as they please. Sin is robbery and cheating. Human beings have become rebels who use God's property, all that is here on this earth, for their own ends. You condemned the man in the first case who did that kind of thing. Well, what have you done with your soul? What have you made of the life that God has given you for just a short time? Consider what you are doing. Your sins are under your own condemnation, let alone that of God. But also consider the man in the second case who throws away and squanders a golden opportunity. What a fool he is, and how we all condemned that man and said that he deserved to lose it all and live in a state of misery. But did you realise that you are condemning yourself? Because God in Christ offers you a new life, a life of power and victory over sin, a life of blessing and of peace and joy. And after you leave this world, he offers to give you free entry into heaven with all the joys of everlasting delights. It is all offered to you. Have you accepted it? Have you grabbed hold of it with both hands and made the most of it? Or do you feel it demands too much? That you enjoy the ways of the world? You prefer to hold on to certain things which never really satisfy. Remember your verdict on the man who did that in the second case? Well, he got what he deserved, we say. Yes, you are right. And the person who refuses God's offer of salvation and eternal life will of necessity go to hell and eternal misery with no one to blame but themselves. And let's not forget the third case, as this is the ultimate. The man who rejected the gracious, loving action. But that is the precise action all of us who are not Christians, that's all that we do. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came down to earth to live amongst us. And God, in his infinite love, sent him, and he came. He came to die for sins and to open the door of heaven for us. He suffered in life, and he endured a cruel death for all of you. In him, God offers you forgiveness for all the past sins, whatever you may have been, and all that you have done, and all the blessings that I've mentioned are available. Have you ever thanked him for doing so? Have you ever shown your appreciation and gratitude by turning to him, by living a life that pleases him in all things and in every way? Do you remember what you thought about the man who did not do that in our third case? And again, you were right. There is no need to argue about these things. You see, the person who rejects the offer of God's eternal love deserves nothing and can expect nothing but the sentence of hell. And there is no excuse. And you have condemned yourself. Sin is utterly indefensible, and it deserves punishment. And therefore, thirdly, sin demands death. That's the reality. Because sin is so awful, it deserves death. It demands death. But for one thing, that will be the fate of us all. For all have sinned. Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned, all fall short of God's glorious standard. In other words, we have all robbed God, we have all spurned his love, we have all rejected his offer and his eternal love. And were we all sent to hell, we could not complain. We have nothing to complain about. For we must all say with David to Nathan in 2 Samuel 12:13, I have sinned against the Lord. But blessed be the name of God, because the reply comes back in an infinitely more glorious way than it could ever come from the lips of Nathan. 2 Samuel 12:13, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. God has taken it away by putting your sin on the holy, spotless shoulders of his only beloved Son, Jesus Christ. As Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 5:21, for God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sin, so that we could be made right with God through Christ. We shall not die, because Jesus has died for us and accomplished a perfect atonement on our behalf. And because of that death, we can have a new life. Life more abundantly. Life which is life to the full. Life that God wants us to live. And we can receive his life and his nature by the power which he gives. We can overcome the terrible force called sin. See, a Christian does not have to be someone who is always given into the power of sin, because we have victory through Christ. See, the problem of life is sin. Sin in its guilt, its power, its pollution, and the only solution is Christ and him crucified. Why? Because he cancels the guilt, he breaks the power, and he transforms our nature. Why would you not want to say, in the words of Paul in 2 Corinthians 9:15, thanks be to God for his indescribable gift? Let's pray together. Let's just take a moment and be quiet. I realise the message this morning is a difficult one to listen to. It's a difficult one to preach. The reality is that sin is something that affects every single one of us. For many of us, we recognise our need of a Saviour. We understand how sinful we are. And we turn to Christ. And we accepted the free offer of salvation. And we know that even though we mess up and even though we give in to sin on occasions, we know that we are still saved and forgiven because Christ's death covers it all. Not that we desire to sin and it just doesn't matter, but we want to do the right thing, but we still make mistakes. But there may be some of us here this morning who may have been coming for many, many months. And we're blasé about salvation and Christ and what he did on the cross. We're blasé about our predicament. Oh yes, we're very easy to point the finger at someone who does something wrong. But we don't look at ourselves. And we don't look at the disastrous, the terrible position that we are in without Christ. So I humbly and I gently, but I do strongly challenge you to think on these things. That unless you have Jesus Christ as your Saviour, sin condemns you. And your eternal reality is hell and misery. And separation from God. Separation also from those that you love who are followers of Christ. And yet it doesn't have to be that way, because God in Christ offers you the way out. He offers you salvation. I challenge you. Come to Christ. And our Father, you know our hearts. You know how we stand before you. We know that for many here, we are thankful. We're thankful for the Lord Jesus Christ and what he did through his saving work. We recognise that the condemning nature of sin. We recognise ourselves as sinners. And there was a point where we saw and realised and wanted a Saviour. And Jesus Christ is that Saviour, because he alone has paid the price. And so we are thankful for your grace. But for those of us here who've never taken that step, maybe for the very first time, we realise that we need a Saviour. We realise that we have sinned against God, that what we have done has displeased him. And that for the very first time, we know we need to do something about this. Lord, convict us, but more importantly, move us to do something about these things. Father, we thank you that through Christ, through his death and his resurrection, he has made it possible that we can know you personally, and all the wonderful benefits and all the joy that comes with that. May we be thankful for your indescribable gift, the Lord Jesus Christ himself. In his name we pray. Amen.